Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to Breaking Points. Great to see you, Emily.
I'm back. I'm so sorry to the haters.
Three lady shows in a row.
It's been
See if the audience can handle it.
We did say that Ryan is going to have to compensate with extra masculinity this week.
Yeah, so he's mentally preparing for that. Tomorrow we have, should I reveal the special celebrity guest host?
Absolutely.
So Tim Miller of The Bulwark. So we can talk about, his evolution, which I'm curious to hear him talk about, and get his, of course, opinion on news of the day. And he and I may have some disagreements about where the Democratic Party should head from here. So it should be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, because he's really a convert. He's not just a never Trump Republican. He's actually had an ideological transition to really to the left, or at least the center left, not the left. So he has a fascinating story. This is really exciting. He's also fun, and
I don't know him at all.
A great sense of humor.
Yeah, so I don't know him at all. So I'm looking forward to, having a dialogue with him and see where that goes.
A dialogue.
Should be good.
Okay, tune in tomorrow for dialogue.
For dialogue, that's what everybody... That's why we put in the headline, Krystal Dialogues with Tim Miller. That'll be a hot ticket for that one.
Listen, I would still click.
Thanks, Em. Appreciate that. You and my mom. Thank you. Okay, there is a lot of breaking news this morning. We have, I don't think you can call it a China deal, but a major step back from the tariff regime. Some may call it complete capitulation. But we can talk through the details of what we know after those meetings. We've got big news coming out of the Middle East as President Trump heads to the region this week. Confirmation that we are now in direct talks with Hamas, and a U.S. American citizen hostage is going to be released as sort of like a, attempt by Hamas, sign of good faith, something of that nature. So Jeremy Scale is going to join us to break down all of that. He has some new reporting, so always great to talk to him.
Yeah, no, I mean, he has fresh reporting, so we are going to get updates straight from Jeremy in just a bit, so make sure to stay tuned for that.
Yeah, we also have Stephen Miller floating the suspension of habeas corpus, so that seems pretty significant. We have President Trump out with a big truth social about prescription drug prices.
This is big. We'll see what happens.
Maybe. I mean, we can talk about it. He did the same thing basically in the first term.
It's just an executive order.
Blocked it.
Yeah.
Right. So it may not be something you can do by executive order.
It likely is not, although I think Roe kind of has legislation on that front. So there might be something they could do through Congress if Trump has the will and if congressional Republicans want to get on board, and that is a big if.
Giant if there.
If.
In addition, we have a new Kanye West song. I regret to inform you, it is everything you would expect it to be at this point in his life and career. And I recorded yesterday an interview with the mayor of Newark. He is the one who was arrested outside of that ICE facility charged with trespassing. He, of course, denies the charges. Trump administration is now threatening the 3 Democratic members of Congress who were there at that ICE facility as well, with threatening them with arrest and claiming that they assaulted ICE agents who were there, federal agents who were there. So in any case, I asked him all the questions about that, his timeline, what his experience of what went down there was as well. And we had some video too that we could take a look at. And then after the show for our premium subscribers, Emily and I are going to be doing that AMA live. So if you want to participate in that, breakingpoints.com. Thank you so much to everybody who has been signing up and supporting the show, making that Friday show happen, which I personally really enjoy doing.
So much fun.
I think it's really fun.
So much fun. Also, you and Kyle last week. Just taking the second half, and it was cathartic, I think, for everyone.
Was it?
Yeah, it's fun.
I feel like the opinions are divided on that, but yeah.
No,
I enjoyed it. Kyle enjoyed it.
Of course. I mean, it would be bad if you didn't. That was the worst.
That would be a bad sign. So in any case, thank you for supporting us and making that happen. And thank you guys also to those of you who are just liking, sharing, subscribing. All of that really makes a big difference as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get into what we know about these China talks. All right, guys, we have some huge news with regard to the Trump administration's trade war vis-a-vis China in particular, where negotiators met over the weekend. In particular, the specifics as we know them are there's going to be a 90-day pause on the full 145% tariffs that have been levied against China. China is going to drop their tariff rate for us down to 10%. We are going to drop our tariff rate on China down to 30%. Trump administration officials were out making the case for this temporary pause and deal. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
Joe, this is going to go where the president wants it to go. I was in touch with him over the weekend, and he wants free trade, free and fair trade. We've had free trade. And as you said, that has not worked for the American people. There's something called the China shock, which has gutted our manufacturing sector. And China has a different form of government for us. They have a different economic model where they subsidize labor, they subsidize capital goods, and they have exported that to us and the rest of the world. We have put up tariffs to push back on that. So it will be a matter of what is the equilibrium level on tariffs and also getting China to open their markets for American companies. Because China actually has a low tariff regime, but it is the non-tariff trade barriers that can be the most difficult to overcome. So we will be focusing on the non-tariff trade barriers and the subsidies, and the idea that China can become more open to American business, and the things that are sold into the U.S. Can not have the same level of subsidy. And no one wants to do a generalized decoupling, but we are going to do a strategic decoupling because we realized during COVID that efficient supply chains were not secure supply chains. So with steel, with semiconductors, with medicines, with a couple of other strategic categories, we are going to have to become self-reliant again.
So, Emily, he's calling this a strategic decoupling. Let's go ahead and put New York Times up on the screen. We've got a great chart here showing the levels. First, you had 10%, then you had 20%, then you had 54%, then you had 104%, then you have 145%. I'm just going to read a little bit of this article as well so you can hear the specifics as we know them at this point. The U.S. and China said Monday they reached an agreement to temporarily reduce the punishing tariffs they've imposed on each other while they try to defuse the trade war threatening the world's two largest economies. In a joint statement, the countries said they would suspend their respective tariffs for 90 days and continue negotiations they started this weekend. Under the agreement, the U.S. would reduce the tariff on Chinese imports to 30% from its current 145%, while China would lower its import duty on American goods to 10% from 125%. We concluded that we have a shared interest, said Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent at a news conference in Geneva. The consensus from both delegations is that neither side wanted a decoupling, he said. So this is really being interpreted as, I mean, I think you have to call it effectively a capitulation on the part of the Trump administration. And some of the numbers, Emily, that came in that I think have to impact them is, number one, concern over the bond market, concern over the stock market, and how dour things were looking there. But in addition, China seemed much more able to withstand this extraordinary trade war than perhaps the Trump administration anticipated. We mentioned last week, numbers just came in that actually showed Chinese exports rising even as these punishing tariffs had been levied against them. So that indicated that they were kind of in it for the long haul. They took some initial retaliatory actions, including, one of the things they instituted export controls on these rare earth minerals that are really critical. I'm seeing some indications on Twitter, but I don't have it confirmed yet, that those are actually going to stay in place. But they got to a certain point where they said, basically, we're not going to do anything else, and you're going to have to come to us when you're ready to act responsibly here. And I think the Trump administration realized between the stock market, the bond market, and also the Chinese government's ability to withstand these tariffs better than they had previously expected, that they needed to act or there was going to be an imminent economic catastrophe complete with shortages, empty shelves, inflation. And it's also not clear that all of that will be forestalled, because 30% tariffs is still a very high number.
I was going to say, yeah, I think whether this is a capitulation is going to play out over the course of the next 90 days, because this is a 90-day pause. And if you are a small business owner, that's still really terrifying. That's still a lot of uncertainty. I'm perfectly prepared and eager to be pleasantly surprised by this. I think the idea of a strategic decoupling is directionally exactly accurate. The confusion and chaos that reigned for a couple of weeks after Liberation Day, if it goes down in the annals of history as being a month of chaos and confusion that led to a quote unquote strategic decoupling, it's interesting to see Bessent saying, on the one hand, we realize we have multiple interests that align, and that at the same time nobody wants to do a general decoupling, so we're doing a strategic decoupling. It's really interesting, and his number here is that both sides de-escalated escalated by, quote, 115%. That's more from his interview on Morning Joe. Very interesting, by the way, that they sent Scott Besson onto Morning Joe the day after this announcement is made. He was on Bloomberg as well, I think, but for him to go on Morning Joe was actually pretty interesting to make a big trade announcement.
Yeah, true.
I mean, but we'll put that aside for now. So what this actually accomplishes, I just think is still completely out in the open for the next 90 days. I hope it's good, but 90 days from now, we could be back where we were tomorrow. Let's say the 90-day pause becomes an 89 or a 1-day pause. You know, like we actually still don't really know.
Yeah. So yes, you still have a high level of uncertainty that hangs over this whole trade war. Charles Gasparino, who's the Fox Business senior correspondent and who's been the beneficiary of a lot of leaks from the Trump administration, so he's been really important to read. He says, breaking, Trump raised tariffs on the world. The markets, particularly the bond market, which we need to finance our debt, rebelled. Trump then was forced to back off. End of story. Film at 11 of the president spinning this as a major victory. Okay, sorry, I couldn't help myself, but what we have seen is a little lesson on how markets exert their power, how when you have to depend on them, as we still do, and remember it's really the budget deficit that's causing the trade deficit, and we need the budget deficit to maintain our standard of living, you can't go to trade war with the world without bad stuff happening. So this is someone who's been, very sympathetic, I would say, to the Trump administration. He's on Fox Business, so he has those ideological inclinations, saying basically Trump folded. And I think you have to look at it.
He's definitely a free trader.
For sure, yeah, true. I think you have to, though, look at it in that light, just given the fact that there really was not much here in terms of quote-unquote face-saving gestures even from the Chinese government. There was some discussion of fentanyl and some talks about how they may do more to curb the production export of the ingredients that go into making fentanyl. So there was some discussion around that. That's really about it. So the Chinese government's calculation that they could basically do nothing and that the Trump administration would have to fold and come to them to back off of this ends up pretty much being correct. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I think the most dire possible circumstances of a complete economic collapse, I think that will likely be forestalled by this announcement and scaling back. Because when you are talking about 145% tariff, you are talking about a complete cutoff. And you all know how many things that we need in this country that you have in your own households that are made in China. So that is forestalled. So the very worst of a potential economic calamity at least gets pushed off for the moment. But we also shouldn't underestimate that 30%, I mean, if you think of if they directly hiked your taxes 30% or even 10%, that is really significant. So if we had started Liberation Day, I think, what was the initial tariff that was announced on Liberation Day vis-a-vis China? It very quickly escalated. But if we had started from a position of 30% across the board tariffs on China, that was more than what Trump ever floated during his campaign. So it's still quite a high and very significant number. And I think you still have to worry about the inflationary impacts both of this 30% tariff on China and the 10% tariffs that are sort of across the board. Howard Lutnick was out saying effectively that he thinks 10% may just be the going rate, tariff rate going forward. That alone could have significant inflationary effects. But there's no doubt some of the most potential catastrophic fallout here should be forestalled by walking away, by effectively blinking vis-a-vis this trade war with China. One last thing, Emily, before I get your reaction too, is I think it's also an indictment of the strategy that they deployed of pissing off everyone in the world going into this. If this really is about China, then you would want to have Japan on your side. You would want to make sure Europe's on your side. You want to make sure Canada's on your side. You would want to gather your allies and have some sort of a unified front. Instead, those allies were increasingly uniting against you and, with very few exceptions, actually sort of holding the line together in a relatively unified front. That also made the position fundamentally unsustainable from the American perspective.
Yeah, and I want to say also, I mean, there will be a lot of people coming out afterwards. If let's say 90 days from now, there's this is fine, things have stabilized, and maybe if you're a free trader, you're still upset with this, but things are stabilized and they aren't the chaos that people felt on April 2nd, Liberation Day. There will be a lot of people saying, Trump was right all along, the haters were wrong once again. But I think also in this case, it's very clear that the haters put up guardrails. I think the good faith haters, let's say on the right, at least probably convinced people like Besant and Trump himself to take another look at the execution of these policies. Now, the 10% tariff was, before it was actually implemented, seen as insane and extreme. And now, because the reciprocal tariffs across the board were even crazier, Trump has successfully, at the very least, numbed people to the idea of a 10% tariff across the board. The Liberation Day announcement was a 34% tariff on China, so reciprocal tariff on China. So to Krystal, that gets to your point about capitulation. He's coming down pretty damn close to that level. Now, the Dow has surged more than 1,000 points as of when we're taping this. So big market jump. I think CNBC and some coverage this morning used the word explosion. The markets are exploding. So we'll see to what extent the Trump administration touts that. I will still say, this is Joe Weisenthal, S&P 500 only down 1.25% this year. I'm sure some people in the Trump administration actually will tout that. But the point that they made actually remains when the market was plunging, that has limited impacts on the working class compared to the wealthy. And so they still have a long way to go to dig themselves, I shouldn't say dig themselves out of the hole, but to prove that this strategy is more stabilizing than chaotic, because these 90-day pauses, if I'm a small business owner, these are just, they're killing you.
Horrible. Yeah. And again, 30% is still quite significant. But you also have to ask, okay, so you did all this. Okay, the market isn't down catastrophically, but it's still down. The likelihood of recession is still up significantly from where you started the administration. And for what? What did you accomplish?
Right.
So for the people who thought that there was a grand plan that was being executed here, who were all on board for a kind of, very radical reorienting of the global economic order, that's decidedly off the table, at least for 90 days. That is very much off the table at this point. This will, if anything, be, a mild sort of tinkering around the edges. So, I think that theory that there was a grand plan, maybe there was a grand plan, but they had to back away from it in the face of realizing that they had made some faulty assumptions going in.
I think the grand plan was chaos. I think that's really,
so?
I think
my theory of the grand plan was always just power for Trump, being able to do whatever he wants.
Well, yeah, I think he wanted to be able to set off global chaos, and with the belief that was his leverage, that his leverage is that we're the United States, we can upend your systems, we can upend the global financial system with the flick of a pen from the President of the United States, with this chart that we printed out that has penguin tariffs on it. I think part of his strategy was actually just throwing everything into chaos. And I think when the bond market started freaking out, the realization is that leverage only goes so far, because it ends up hitting your own people at some point.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I do think there was just a fundamental miscalculation, both with launching the trade war against everyone in the world and with thinking that that we were in a stronger position than the Chinese were. And we just weren't. We just weren't. It was easier for them to find other customers around the world, as evidenced by their exports actually rising during this period, than it was for us to be able to replace all of the goods that we rely on importing from China at this point. Now, that could be done over a longer period of time, which will require, as we've discussed many times on the show, significant investments in industrial policy. And yet they were going the opposite direction of that. And I know they were, had big hopes for the tax cut that is supposed to be in the reconciliation bill, but none of that has even come to pass as of yet. I wanted to read, because we've relied on his analysis a fair amount, for a read on how the Chinese may be viewing these events. Arnaud Bertrand had initial reaction to China's statement on the agreement with the U.S. He says they highlight that besides the fact that tariffs would be reduced, he says to 10%. There was some confusion about this. We went and checked. It's actually to 30%. But in any case, he says a key outcome of the meeting is that both sides, quote, recognize the importance of bilateral economic and trade relations to the two countries and the global economy, recognize the importance of sustainable, long-term, and mutually beneficial bilateral economic and trade relations, and continue to advance relevant work in the spirit of mutual openness, continuous communication, cooperation, and mutual respect. This is indeed perhaps the most important outcome. Trump's tariffs mark the apex of Washington's decoupling illusion, and this reversal should deter any future attempts of doing the same. To use the card analogy that the Trump administration loves to use, Trump went all in with his extreme tariffs, but when China called his bluff, he was forced to fold and accept that his approach could not be sustained. It is now clear, when it comes to severing economic ties with China, the U.S. simply does not have the cards, no matter how aggressively they try to play them. So with that in mind, you're left with only one viable strategy: cooperation and mutual respect. So that's his reading of the, the contours of the at least temporary agreement that we have at this point.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent China was reacting to other deals that the Trump administration was working on with places like you said, they had already found some willingness in that region, particularly to have, Temu ship things over to Cambodia,
or Vietnam,
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent actually they saw that some of those countries actually do rely so heavily on U.S. business that the Trump administration was coming to, if not, great deals for the American people, at least deals. So I'm curious to what extent they were reacting to that. I'm also really curious what this does to the crackdown on de minimis, and I'm really curious for how this pertains to the Hollywood announcement last Sunday? Yeah, last Sunday, so a week.
Yeah,
and then
that's another thing I always thought was fake.
TikTok. I'm really curious what this does for the TikTok deal, because remember China's retaliation about a month ago. It scuttled that last-minute deal that the Trump administration allegedly was very close to working out for a sale of TikTok from ByteDance to a U.S. company. And by the way, I've always thought that that was fake, because not that there aren't buyers here that'll snatch up TikTok very eagerly, but that I don't think China has any serious intention of actually selling TikTok, because guess what? They have the freaking leverage, because Trump doesn't want TikTok to be sold to a U.S. company over and over again. I mean, that's why he's delaying it over and over again. He knows that they have the leverage on that point. So that's just a huge section of the economy and of the average young American's daily life that's on the table here, and we don't really know what's going to happen going forward.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. So, all of the, and this has been the overall trend of the Trump administration trade war, because we've had all these fits and starts, first with regard to Canada and Mexico, and you'll have his defenders, defend these extraordinarily maximalist policy positions of 145% tariffs and total decoupling of China, and they're all in on it, and this is delivering for Main Street, and then they get rolled back, and it's, art of the deal. But, with this, it's hard to even point to what was actually achieved here, because now they're backing away from the total decoupling. So if you were in we're going to do this hard reset and it's going to reindustrialize America, that's not happening. Apparently the tariffs are not going to be, paying for the budget deficit. That's not happening. And you have not actually gotten any real concessions from the Chinese government out of this. You've just made it more likely we're going to face recession, more likely we're going to face inflation and higher costs on goods. So Trump walking away from this, walking back from the most maximalist policy position, it's just hard to see how we're in any way better off and not worse off from before Liberation Day was originally announced. I mean, the lack of even any real face-saving gesture here, I think, is pretty extraordinary. But, I'm glad to see that the worst of the potential economic calamity is, at least for the moment, being put off the table. And at the same time, just to conclude here, I don't want to underestimate how there still, first of all, will likely be reverberating impacts from this pause in trade that we did have. We saw in COVID how the supply shocks took a long time to work out. So I think you could have reverberating impacts from that. And then the continued, tariff regime that does exist around the world, impacts from that. And to your point, Emily, the continued uncertainty, because this guy, if he doesn't like the headlines that come out of this and he's feeling a certain kind of way and he wants to reassert his authority or whatever, they could be hiked back up to 200% tomorrow. We just have no idea.
Well, and China has a very long-term strategy in its economy and its society more broadly. And right now, by the way, if you're a foreign investor, not even in China, you don't even know how the next United States president is going to handle this question, let alone the next 3 years. The level of uncertainty in the U.S. market right now is just dramatic. And to underscore that, Krystal, even as we were talking here, Trump is giving a press conference, and he has said that he's not looking to hurt China, that he plans to speak to Xi Jinping maybe by the end of the week, and also that the China deal does not include tariffs that are already on. So we're learning more about this by the minute based on what the President of the United States says. But it's really hard not just to understand what's happening. Like, to get the exact numbers, we had to sift through, just this morning before Trump started speaking, we had to sift through a lot of different reports because the flow of information is confusing. So that's just day by day, let alone trying to project out into the future. The uncertainty is so significant.
Yeah, indeed. So I'm sure I'll be covering this more tomorrow. As we get more information, and we'll be able to play some of those clips from Trump's press conference today and figure out what exactly the hell is going on.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.